Alright, it's Barry and today on Grow It I've got the first of a new series where I'll be taking a look at where our favourite plants, fruits, vegetables and all sorts of other gardening things come from. Today we're starting with tomatoes, so don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this and all my other gardening guides with a new video every Tuesday, and don't forget to start the weekend with my seed of the week that you can start sowing straight away, which is every Saturday morning. To start with the most basic part, tomatoes are the fruit of the tomato plant Solanum lycopersicum, and they're unusual as fruits in that they're most often associated with savoury foods rather than sweet ones, which is why they can often be incorrectly described as a vegetable. But I think by this point most people know, or at least accept, that tomatoes are fruits, which applies to loads of other fruits that are mistaken for vegetables as well, like cucumbers, pumpkins, squashes and aubergines. The scientific name Solanum lycopersicum is made up of the name of the genus, Solanum, and the second part, lycopersicum, is a name of Greek origin that can be split into two parts. So we've got lyco, which means wolf, and persicum, which is peach. So put those together and we've got wolf peaches, which has links to the tomato's supernatural past as well, which I'll get onto later. The more recognisable common name tomato originates with the Spanish word tomate, which in itself comes from the Nahuatl word tomatl. I'm not sure, I can't pronounce it properly, but it's a language that was from central Mexico and it's still spoken now, but it was also spoken by the Aztecs, who were responsible for the original domestication of the tomato. In modern English, the pronunciation is split between how we pronounce it, tomato, correct, and the American pronunciation, tomato, which I'm sure is an argument that's still going to be going on come the apocalypse, so I'll just leave it at that. But going back to classifications, the Solanum genus is quite a diverse one, consisting of around 2,000 species of flowering plants, including potato plants, tobacco, aubergines, also known as eggplants, and a load of other nightshades and horse nettles as well. It's really easy to see the similarities between the closely related Solanum plants when you look at the fruits, in particular the fruits of potato plants, which you definitely shouldn't eat, and they look like little green tomatoes, and aubergines are eggplants which look like elongated purple tomatoes, or even peppers, which you can be hot or sweet, which are sort of like hollow tomatoes but with thicker skin. Solanaceae is a family of over 2,700 plants forming 98 genera, commonly referred to as nightshades, and a common feature of plants in this family is the production of a diverse range of alkaloids, which are secondary chemical compounds, and they're usually produced as a defense system against herbivores and insects, which have been exploited for all kinds of uses throughout history, with compounds that include nicotine that's produced in large quantities in the leaf of the tobacco plant, and that's made as a neurotoxin defense against herbivorous insects. And now it's $1 billion global market in the tobacco industry. Tomato, potato and aubergines also contain nicotine, but you don't have to worry about getting addicted to those with like Homer Simpson's tobacco, as we're talking quantities up to 1 million times lower than what you get in tobacco leaves. And then we have solanine, which is a particularly toxic compound that can make you fairly sick, but can also be deadly if you eat enough of it, which is why you shouldn't eat green potatoes, as it tends to accumulate in the green bits. Another well-known alkaloid is capsaicin, which is what makes chili peppers hot, and that is a defense against mammals that might want to eat the fruit, because the preferred method of seed distribution is by bird, since they'll happily eat all of the chilies completely unaffected by the capsaicin, fly around and distribute the seeds everywhere. Tomatoes are grown on vines which are decumbent, and that means that they just like to grow along the ground, a bit like a pumpkin vine, but we tend to grow them vertically using canes and supports, or on occasion some varieties like to be grown in a hanging basket with the plant trailing back down to the ground. They can usually be categorised into two types. We've got determinate tomatoes, which tend to ripen all of the fruit in a short period of time, maybe 2 weeks or so, and then we've got indeterminate tomatoes, which are the common varieties like Moneymaker or Gardener's Delight, which will fruit all the way through the season until they die back in autumn once it gets a bit colder. The original ancestral tomato plant variety, Solanum pimpinellifolium, grows tiny berries that are close to the size of peas or blueberries, which were domesticated and bred by the Aztecs to produce edible fruit for use in cooking by around 500 BC, with varieties ranging from bright reds to greens and yellow fruit in different shapes and sizes. The first tomato to make it to Europe was yellow, and it was brought by the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés in 1521, and they were first mentioned in Italian botanical literature in 1544 and later named golden apples in the 1550s, with the earliest discovered cookbook featuring tomato recipes published in Naples in 1692. Spanish colonization of South America also led to tomatoes being distributed throughout the Caribbean and Southeast Asia before making their way through the entire entirety of Asia later on. As is always the way though, things had to be different in England. They weren't grown here until at least the 1590s, with one of the earliest tomato cultivators, the influential grower John Gerard, reporting them to be poisonous, corrupt, rank and stinking, despite knowing that they were eaten in Spain and Italy and everyone was fine, which led to the general consensus that tomatoes were not to be eaten. This was backed up by the correct classification of tomatoes as nightshades, which meant it was quickly recognised as a close relative of the poisonous deadly nightshade and the mandrake plant, whose roots were closely associated with witchcraft. The notion that tomatoes were poisonous was also given further weight after they were served at banquets, causing everyone who ate them to become seriously ill, but it was actually down to the acid from the tomatoes dissolving and leaching the lead from the metal plates, giving everyone who had eaten tomatoes lead poisoning. These beliefs lasted for quite a long time in Britain and amongst North American colonies, but they did manage to find their way into the recipe books by the mid-1700s. Although they were still a fancy luxury item and definitely not the staple food that they are now. For most of this time they were grown as ornamental plants alongside other nightshades like potatoes, especially in botanical gardens where people come to see the red fruit. It's hard to imagine a world where we don't eat potatoes or tomatoes and just look at them in gardens. The first documented evidence of tomatoes in North America is dated to 1710, and they were spotted by a chap called William Salmon in the region that's now known as South Carolina, and it's suspected that they found the way there from the Caribbean rather than Europe, although Thomas Jefferson is said to have eaten tomatoes in Paris and enjoyed them so much that he sent the seeds back home to America so that they could grow some for him for when he got back. Later in the 19th century, Alexander Livingston is credited as being a pioneer in tomato breeding for garden and commercial use, with his first variety, the Paragon, introduced in 1870, and his 1875 variety, the Acme, being involved in the parentage of most of the varieties of bred tomatoes in the 20th century. With perfect conditions for tomato growing in Florida and California, millions of tomatoes are now grown for commercial use on tomato farms every year. Interestingly, tomatoes used to taste a lot better, and they were also a lot sweeter than they are now as well, but these characteristics were lost as a result of breeding tomatoes to be completely red in colour, which got rid of a green ring that used to be around the top, and it also meant that less sugar was produced by the fruit during ripening. In fact, it is proven quite difficult to breed favourable traits into tomatoes, such as larger fruit or longer shelf life, without introducing a negative trait as well, such as poor flavour or lower nutritional value. So tomato breeding really is a tricky business. This is where things get a little bit stranger, because when tomatoes arrived in Europe, the continent was caught up in the mass hysteria of witch hunting, which led to widespread government sanctioned executions and mob lynchings of up to 500,000 suspected witches. But what did tomatoes have to do with all this, I suppose you're asking? Well, witches, they were thought to use a magic ointment that they had to use on the brooms or themselves to make themselves fly, and it also doubled up as being able to turn people into werewolves as well. And this ointment was studied by the Pope's physician, and he recorded the ingredients as being hemlock and three very close relatives to the tomato: nightshade, henbane and mandrake. And chances are that this was just used as a painkiller or a hallucinogenic rather than a magic flying goo. But the newly arrived exotic tomato plant looked a lot like the nightshade plant, and the fruit looked similar enough to mandrake fruit for unfamiliar observers to jump to the conclusion that witchcraft was going down. It also didn't help that the tomatoes have been described as wolf peaches, and it's easy now to appreciate how quickly and easily the word could spread about the mysterious wolf peach and its werewolf transformation inducing properties. So between tomatoes being mistakenly implicated in the production of magic ointments and lycanthropy, it's easy to understand why they weren't at the top of everyone's seed shopping list like they are today. Well, all that's left to wonder is where tomatoes are going to go next, and I suppose the most obvious answer is space. There's loads of research going on, funded by the likes of NASA, to develop tomato varieties that will be able to be grown successfully in Martian soil. And, well, it's technically speaking regolith, and it's also toxic and sterile, so it's quite a lot more complicated than just planting plants into the ground there. And that's the job of the fantastically titled astrobotanists, to develop plants that will grow under the totally different conditions of other planets, with less energy from the sun, different day and year lengths, different gravities, and of course the problem of breathable air. We do already have the technology to grow indoors in the form of hydroponics and aeroponics, with aeroponics being the method that NASA are particularly interested in, as rather than being grown with the roots in a tank of water like we do in hydroponics, aeroponics uses a fine mist of water with the nutrients mixed in, blowing over the the roots, and that's a process that uses significantly less water than hydroponics does, which in itself uses a lot less water than what we need for traditional soil growing. As you would expect, water conservation is a top priority, whether you're growing tomatoes on another planet or just here on Earth. For example, in areas where drought or poor water availability mean that water-hungry crops that could provide food for everyone can become available thanks to the advanced methods of low water growing. So there is a benefit from this research for everyone, no matter what planet we live on. So that's where tomatoes come from, and possibly where they're going to be going to in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out on all my videos, especially if you're into tomato growing, because I've got some really cool tomato videos coming up in the spring. And let me know in the comment section if there's another fruit or vegetable origin story that you'd like me to investigate. I'll see you next time.